Smith has a rare record of prosecuting actual presidents and heads of state. He's faced down the arguments against doing so already, the warnings that you hear about a cycle of prosecution and debates about line drawing or whether this all becomes politics. So he's ready if he gets to a point that he decides to indict Trump. He indicted a sitting president of Kosovo for war crimes. That president, Thaçi, accused of leading militants to mass murder.
Now his past has caught up with him.
President of Kosovo, Hashim Thaçi, is in The Hague for an interview with prosecutors who have indicted him on war crimes charges.
He's been charged with 10 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Huge deal, even if you didn't hear about it because it's in a different region. But that president impugned the whole trial. And yet in that and other human rights cases, Smith gives no quarter to those kind of attacks. He just calmly, persistently lays out what he says is the truth of his evidence, citing the war crimes he says he's pursuing.
The truth will be laid before this court in the coming weeks. My office will be unrelenting and unstopping. Fair administration of justice requires institutions that can protect those who seek justice. Mustafa used their power to victimize and to brutalize fellow Kosovar Albanians. No justification whatsoever for the inhumane conditions under which they were held or for the manner in which they were brutalized and tortured during their detainment. Watch this trial and watch those that follow. Watch how this court functions and then judge.
That's how he does it. Lays it out. It's pretty much that even keeled the whole time. Now, just as Smith's prosecutions had that history I mentioned with Mayor Giuliani, he had his own brush with the Trump administration, announcing charges in the case I just mentioned 3 days before that indicted president, Thaçi, was actually going to attend a Trump White House summit. Smith's prosecutors were trying to stop him from using the meeting with Trump to pressure the U.S. to drop the case. Now, that was an option available to Smith, but honestly, a really bold one. The prosecutor was keeping an eye on the real-world dynamics out there, outside the courtroom, in an effort to protect his quest for justice inside the courtroom. Smith determined he was, in his view, dealing with a war criminal who could possibly convince Trump to do a favor for a war criminal. So Smith used the legal powers he had in court to try to checkmate that move first, and determining, basically, that he didn't want Trump to give out that favor. There the two of them are together in 2018. The defendant had made repeated efforts as well to obstruct and undermine the prosecution, waging a secret campaign to overturn the law creating the court, a tactic familiar for mafia cases, other war crimes cases, as well as obviously Donald Trump's approach to several DOJ probes. Again, you don't have to be Jack Smith or a super lawyer to notice that probe after probe, Mueller to Jan 6, Trump is doing that kind of stuff. He stands accused of it. So Smith knows those moves. He made a point of actually raising them in this case I told you about, vowing accountability no matter how much time was passed.
There can never be an expiration date on accountability. You will hear from victims who have waited 2 decades to be heard. The charges here do not directly concern the events of the war in Kosovo occurring over 20 years ago. They concern attempts to intimidate people into not telling this court what happened to them 20 years ago, and attempts to obstruct the work of this institution at any cost.
Talking about obstruction, people trying to stop the work while he does it. If you're hearing echoes of Liz Cheney's accusation against Trump over that kind of obstruction and witness intimidation in the coup probe, well, the alleged coup is part of what Smith is now probing, in not the committee, not the House doing it, but the actual DOJ. There's also parallels in how Smith has confronted authoritarians who try to use lies and media as part of an alleged criminal plot. Here's Smith again in this rare footage.
The accused in committing their crimes tried to amplify the damage they caused by exhorting the media in Kosovo to publish. The ethical journalists of Kosovo refused to publish the documents that the accused attempted to provide them.
Now, very different historical context, but very interesting to see Smith again, deal with the world that we actually live in, how the media and information, claims and lies can be pulled into criminal plots. And while everyone understands, certainly a lawyer like him, that there ought to be a wide berth and protection for speech, speech cannot be something, free speech, that warlords or coup plotters hide behind. When that speech becomes an instrument or a direct action related to coups or crimes. Now, Trump lawyers are already under scrutiny for the possible obstruction in Mar-a-Lago of that case. We don't know whether that type of obstruction probe reaches Trump or not. Indeed, he often uses lawyers as cutouts. But Smith's willingness to roll up obstruction into a wider case is certainly something that Team Trump is going to be worried about. So from obstruction to abuse of power, you have that experience for the probe. The other area of law that involves scrutinizing or charging politicians in our system is called corruption or public integrity. Now, that's usually more about bribes and kickbacks than coups and war crimes. And this is a striking thing you may have heard me mention, but I want to underscore it. For all of Smith's unique experience in prosecuting heads of state or dealing with political pressures like Giuliani at the local level, he also has experience specifically in this area. He ran the DOJ's Department of Public Integrity, which deals with federal corruption. And that wins you no friends in Washington. You spend all this time probing, for example, members of Congress across both parties. Many of them you don't end up charging, but they know you've been probing them. And in one of his only public appearances in that role, Smith was explaining that fair prosecutions for corruption require proving intent. By the way, that's something Donald Trump knows, which is apparently why he's so careful about avoiding records. You have to prove that someone had the corrupt intent at the time. That could be hard to prove. Smith also recounted in this video I'm about to show you how some government officials he thought were in denial about their corruption problems.
What was that person's intent? Did they do this for that? Did they act corruptly? Oftentimes I go places and the first thing I hear is, no, we don't have a corruption problem here, Jack. And my immediate reaction is, you definitely have a corruption problem there.
That hand gesture, by the way, is the most emotive we saw him in any of the footage we reviewed, including at The Hague. Of course, there he was not technically in court, so you might get just a dollop more energy than when he's in court in prosecutor mode. So this experience would sound like a boost for Smith, but I always try to give you all the facts we have, and while Smith's folks have definitely pointed to this as experience, and it is, it can also cut both ways, because I mentioned this is a place, exactly this tough field of dealing with politicians, where he and his team overshot and lost, including a big case where they went after someone I bet you remember, a prominent Democrat who was then spiraling from the heights of his party and political stardom.
Don't you think I chose a great Vice President of the United States of America?
John and I are honest and realistic with the American people.
The story that's sending shockwaves through the presidential campaign. After months of denials, former candidate John Edwards admitted today that he had an extramarital affair while his wife was battling cancer.
The fall from grace for Democrat John Edwards was just as stunning. And tonight, a new low, after a federal grand jury in North Carolina charged him with 6 felonies.
Federal prosecutors say he illegally used $925,000 in contributions to hide his mistress.
Huge case there. Smith in 2011 led that indictment of John Edwards. They brought these campaign finance charges accusing Edwards of using those illegal donations to conceal his mistress from voters. Now, Edwards fought that. And despite not being a very sympathetic person at the time, certainly not someone who was going to rebound in politics at the time, interestingly, he won. Edwards secured a not guilty verdict on one charge and a mistrial on the rest, which the DOJ then declined to try again. Jurors explaining that Smith's prosecution team, when they looked at all the facts and the way that they waged the case, they just did not have the goods.
I felt like the evidence just wasn't there. It could have been more. Yeah, it could have been a lot more. A lot more than what it was.
Could have been a lot more. It was a visible failure. And it came in a context after that same department I mentioned at DOJ had been reeling from prior criticism that had lost its nerve or gotten gun-shy in these kinds of cases. Now, you have to keep in mind, this kind of loss in court is rare. Criminal prosecutors have very high conviction rates. Indeed, they get most defendants to plead out. They go to trial in special cases, and they win. At the time, it was also cast as a, quote, blow to the Justice Department's beleaguered public integrity section helmed by Jack Smith. That's some coverage from the Times and Politico. Now, in that same work dealing with corruption, Smith did notch a victory at a trial level, convicting Republican Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell of corruption charges from his days in office. But even that case was complicated later on appeal when the Supreme Court overturned it. You take it all together, and there are people who would say that's one of the problems in how difficult it is to secure corruption convictions in American law, that that's not a Jack Smith thing, although, again, it shows that when he shot and was really aggressive, sometimes he lost. Sometimes he had to fall back on his heels, and that's interesting for how he approaches this case. You take it all together, and what you have here is the portrait of a very stern, very serious, sober, and often effective prosecutor. At a minimum, he does not seem to be afraid of the things that, as I mentioned to you at the top of this report, seem to cow so many prosecutors. Friends in government, how it's going to look, the bad press, I just showed you some. He seems to be someone who understands that if you go into a country, your own or another, and start indicting sitting or former presidents, there are people who will try to have you pay for it. There will be hell to pay. And like any good prosecutor, independent and nonpartisan, he doesn't seem to care. That's a good thing for the law. Whether that means that Donald Trump will be indicted or not, only time will tell.